Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. By the time Bai Xiaochun returned to the capital city, it was daytime. The giant ghost king hadn't slept the entire night. He'd sat there drinking, occasionally looking up at the sky, and fretting over what Bai Xiaochun was doing. He couldn't stop worrying that he would do something impulsive and cause some sort of disaster. The giant ghost king detected Bai Xiaochun's arrival, and hurried out to meet him. Grabbing him by the shoulders, he said, "You." Shrugging the giant ghost king off, Bai Xiaochun pulled out a jug of alcohol, took a drink, and then proudly said, "Calm down, old pal. Just wait a bit for the fireworks to start. When Bai Xiaochun makes a move, he never comes up short. Giant ghost, old pal, you'll have your position back within 7 days." The giant ghost king was a bit taken aback by how confident Bai Xiaochun seemed. But then he thought back to all the things Bai Xiaochun had done in the wildlands, and didn't feel any more confident. In fact, he felt even more unsettled. You killed Marquis Zilin?" he asked. "Are you kidding me?" Bai Xiaochun said with a glare, irritated at how much the giant ghost king was underestimating him. "I just smeared some muck on his face that he'll never be able to wash off." Bai Xiaochun's plan was outrageous and seemingly beyond belief, and that thought made him chuckle. After all, Celestial Aged Spirit was being a real nasty fellow, and as a result, Bai Xiaochun didn't even want to come up with some perfectly executed scheme. He just wanted to do a bit of muckraking. The giant ghost king still had no idea what was going on, and for the life of him couldn't figure out what Bai Xiaochun was up to. However, Bai Xiaochun was clearly not going to give him any details. Therefore, the giant ghost king simply had to hope that Bai Xiaochun's self-confidence was warranted. Perhaps the clouds really would part soon to reveal the blue sky beyond. Over the course of the following days, the giant ghost king stayed in Bai Xiaochun's mansion, completely wrapped up in anxiety. In contrast, Bai Xiaochun was edgy with excitement to see what would happen. On the afternoon of the third day, in the north of the second immortal domain, the door of Gongsun Wanner's immortals cave opened. Her expression was the same as ever as she calmly walked out into the open. As a celestial, any public appearance she made would attract quite a bit of attention. The first thing she did was issue orders summoning all of the preceptors and devas under her command for a meeting. All of the demigods in the 5 prefectures she commanded jumped to follow her orders. Quickly abandoning whatever other tasks were at hand, they took their devas with them to the meeting. Gongsun Wanner sat in a throne in the position of honor, her eyes closed, her hands resting on the arms of the throne. She was tapping the throne with her index finger, creating a thumping sound that filled the area, causing great pressure to weigh down on her gathered subordinates. None of them even dared to breathe, and just waited there respectfully. Enough time passed for an incense stick to burn, during which time the pressure mounted. Finally, she opened her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "As you know, it was literally overnight that I took over this final northern prefecture in the second immortal domain." Although she spoke slowly and calmly, the truth was that inside, she felt extremely uncomfortable. The incense stick's worth of time just now had been spent struggling internally, and it was almost an accident that she had begun speaking. Her subordinates were immediately taken aback by her words, and were unsure of their implications. A few exchanged awkward glances, but none dared to speak. They just kept their heads bowed and waited for more to come. Bracing herself, Gongsun Wanner went on. "The only reason it went so smoothly is that the preceptor previously in charge of this prefecture, Marquis Zilin of the Saint Emperor dynasty, is secretly loyal to the Vile Emperor dynasty. I will definitely report the matter to the Vile Emperor, so that he gets the credit." Even she found these words to be particularly bizarre, but there was nothing else she could do. Rising to her feet, she left the main hall. Silence reigned. The demigods and devas all looked around with wide eyes, their jaws hanging open. They had assumed that Ghost Mother would summon them to a meeting for some important reason, and simply couldn't imagine why she would call them here just to say this. A long moment passed before everyone recovered enough to start talking. Many a strange expression could be seen on their faces. Did Marquis Zilin offend the exalted celestial? That has to be it. And he must have offended her badly, but considering she's a celestial, couldn't she just directly kill a trifling figure like Marquis Zilin? Why the intrigue? Besides, isn't accusing him publicly too obvious? Who would possibly believe it? The demigods and devas alike were all stunned, and no matter how they considered the situation, they could only come to the conclusion that Ghost Mother hated Marquis Zilin for some reason. However, after talking the matter over, they all agreed that Ghost Mother had clearly called them to this meeting because she wanted their help in spreading the information. They didn't need to worry about what happened afterward, they just needed to spread the news as quickly as possible. Having come to this agreement, they quickly left and headed back to their respective prefectures, where they worked very hard to make sure the news traveled quickly. Before long, all of the northern prefectures were abuzz with the rumor that Marquis Zilin was loyal to the vile emperor dynasty. Of course, the north was only a subsection of the second immortal domain. And of course, both dynasties had spies in the other. So it only took about 4 hours for the news to reach the southern prefectures, including the capital city. It immediately caused quite a stir, and in fact, everyone who heard it was completely stunned. Demigods, devas, nascent soul experts, and core formation cultivators alike were all completely taken aback. The truth was that this rumor seemed completely fabricated. It was ridiculous. Ghost Mother called all of her preceptors together to tell them that? That's crazy. Marquis Zilin helped her take over the final northern prefecture? That's total nonsense. Considering she's a celestial, who could possibly stand against her? Celestial Ghost Mother wants Marquis Zilin to get credit for taking over that prefecture? It's not like Marquis Zilin is an idiot. If he wanted to turn traitor, he could have just gone to the other side. Why would he stay in the Saint Emperor dynasty? Word spread quickly through the southern part of the second immortal domain. It wasn't that everybody disbelieved it. There were a few naive people here and there who thought it was true. But they were in the minority. Most just turned up their noses disdainfully and assumed it was a smear tactic by Ghost Mother. And unfortunately, this smear tactic didn't have any weight at all. It was so ridiculously fake that it made everyone furious. However, the incredibly fake nature of the news ensured that some intelligent people realized that there must be more to the story. And at that point, suspicions began to build. Of course, the person who was most angered was the new preceptor of Godsifter Prefecture, Marquis Zilin himself. When he heard the news, his jaw dropped, and he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. At first, he simply believed himself to have been wrongly accused, but then he realized that someone might be out to hurt him specifically. Whoever it was, that person somehow got Celestial Ghost Mother to make false charges. And whoever that person was, he would likely have realized that the ridiculous smear tactic wouldn't work. And yet, he had done it anyway. The whole situation made Marquis Zilin completely furious. And of course, he already had his suspicions about who was behind it. Eyes flickering, he murmured, "Don't tell me it was that King Heavenspan?" As word spread through the capital city, more and more slanderous talk about Marquis Zilin could be heard. When the giant ghost king finally caught wind of it all, his jaw dropped. Of course, he immediately assumed that Bai Xiaochun was responsible, and sighed at how useless it all seemed. Of course nobody would believe that, the giant ghost king thought. Feeling a headache coming on, he headed over to ask Bai Xiaochun about it. However, as soon as he arrived, he saw Bai Xiaochun walking out of his private chamber, clad in a violet robe adorned with dragons. He wore a kingly crown, and fully radiated the aura of a celestial. There was something profoundly magnificent about him that caused the giant ghost king's breath to catch in his throat. For some reason, this version of Bai Xiaochun seemed completely different from anything he had seen before. He seemed to radiate an aura that placed him above all other living beings. Furthermore, willpower swirled in his eyes. It was as if everything else in existence were mere bugs compared to him. He stood on the peak of the highest mountain, wielding powers that could crush everything else in existence. The giant ghost king was so profoundly shocked that all of the words he had been about to say completely escaped him. He simply stood there looking at this completely different Bai Xiaochun. The clothing he wore was the Taoist robe of a celestial, which had been bestowed upon him by the Saint Emperor after he became a celestial. In the entire Saint Emperor dynasty, only 5 people qualified to wear such clothing. However, they would normally only wear this specific Taoist robe every 10 years, during special rites held in Saint Emperor City. The crown he wore was a similar item. Upon donning this precious treasure of an outfit, Bai Xiaochun's energy transformed, making him very different from before. When Bai Xiaochun saw the giant ghost king's reaction, he felt very proud of himself, and nodded grandly. "Come with me," he said. With that, he headed out of his mansion. Hardly able to breathe, the giant ghost king hurried after him. He had an inkling of what Bai Xiaochun planned to do, and although he still wasn't completely confident, Bai Xiaochun's current appearance somehow made the giant ghost king think back to the first time he had ever seen the Arch-Emperor back in the Wildlands. Back before the Arch-Emperor had been supplanted by the Grand Heaven Master, he was the overlord of all the Wildlands, and his gaze could cause all creation to either tremble, or go completely still. As the giant ghost king followed along, his eyes slowly began to shine. He even subconsciously bowed his head the way a government official would in the presence of an emperor. As Bai Xiaochun walked along, his servants noticed him and were struck to the core. Many of them forgot to breathe and dropped to their knees to kowtow. As he emerged from his mansion onto the street, his magnificence did not decline in the least. In fact, it grew more prominent as he walked toward Celestial Aged Spirit's mansion. Along the way, everyone who saw him was deeply shocked. Regardless of the level of their cultivation base, they gasped and bowed in greeting. Greetings, Celestial. Greetings, Celestial. Greetings, Celestial. At first, the greetings were called out here and there, but eventually, a chorus filled the air. It wasn't necessarily that they wished to greet him this way, but rather, it was an instinct born from the pressure that weighed down on them. Thankfully, his mansion wasn't very far from Celestial Aged Spirit's mansion, and even as his energy reached its peak, he arrived. Ignoring the stunned devas who stood guard out front, Bai Xiaochun entered. Still shaken, the giant ghost king hurried along behind him. The guard's job was to stop people from entering, but at the moment, Bai Xiaochun's surging energy erased any thoughts in their minds of attempting to do such a thing. And thus, he strolled casually into Celestial Aged Spirit's residence. Upon entering, he found that about a dozen or so people were engaged in a discussion in the main hall, Marquis Zilin included. One of them was intentionally masking their aura, but to Bai Xiaochun's eyes, they stuck out like a torch on a moonless night. Even as Bai Xiaochun determined who Celestial Aged Spirit was, that very same beleaguered Celestial looked up. As he did, the doors to the main hall suddenly slammed open, attracting the attention of the demigods inside, including Marquis Zilin. All of them looked around, and what they saw struck them like bolts of lightning. Standing there at the entrance of the hall was Bai Xiaochun, clad in his Celestial's Taoist robe, wearing a kingly crown, and looking like a divine being. Marquis Zilin reacted the same, he was completely stunned. Ignoring all of the demigods, Bai Xiaochun focused his gaze on the old man who held the seat of honor. He wore a violet robe, not the special Taoist robe of a celestial, but spectacular nonetheless. He radiated the aura of a celestial, and as he sat there, it was questionable whether he was corporeal or illusory. Anyone who looked at him for more than a moment would be convinced they were looking at a god. The demigods all stood there, their minds reeling. None of them would ever have guessed that Bai Xiaochun himself would come here, nor that he would do so in a celestial's Taoist robe. As of this moment, he looked exactly like the king that the Saint Emperor had appointed him to be. Even more difficult for them to take was the pressure that was building up between Bai Xiaochun and Celestial Aged Spirit. It left them wanting to scream. Celestial Aged Spirit's eyes narrowed as he looked at Bai Xiaochun, but other than that, his expression didn't change. Despite all the time that had passed, this was their first time meeting in person. My apologies for coming late to this meeting, Bai Xiaochun said calmly, keeping eye contact with Celestial Aged Spirit. Taking a few steps inside, he waved his hand, causing countless stones to suddenly materialize and form together into a huge throne. Then he flicked his sleeve, sat down, and then turned his gaze back to Celestial Aged Spirit. Now, there were thrones on either side of the hall, both of equal height and equal distance from the center. By all means, carry on, Bai Xiaochun said coolly. I'm just fulfilling my obligations to the Saint Emperor. No need to pay attention to me. Everyone else in the hall felt like a catastrophic disaster was about to occur. None of them dared to talk, or even breathe. As for Marquis Zilin, when he saw the giant ghost king standing behind Bai Xiaochun and off to the side, he could only hope that Celestial Aged Spirit would be able to strike fear into Bai Xiaochun's heart. Celestial Aged Spirit looked coldly at Bai Xiaochun for a moment, and then suddenly laughed, a cold laughter filled with scorn. Then he looked away from Bai Xiaochun and said two words. Carry on. The demigods hesitated for a moment, but considering what Celestial Aged Spirit had just said, they had to brace themselves and continue their discussion. Exalted One, I've already begun to investigate the matter regarding Marquis Zilin. It's definitely slander. That's right. It's a tactic the vile Emperor dynasty uses a lot. If we cast suspicion on Marquis Zilin, then we'll be playing right into the vile Emperor dynasty's hands. Your humble servant requests that we make an official proclamation in the second immortal domain, declaring Marquis Zilin's innocence. After everyone had their say, Celestial Aged Spirit's lips curled up into a cold smile. Request granted, he said. Then he rose to leave. However, it was at this point that Bai Xiaochun looked up and said, Hold on, this is very inappropriate, fellow Taoist Aged Spirit. Bai Xiaochun said, his voice echoing back and forth in the enormous main hall. We must act on evidence. Marquis Zilin has been slandered, and we need proof of who did it. I find it hard to believe that the mighty celestial ghost mother of the vile Emperor dynasty would slander a trifling demigod. Unless, our Marquis Zilin managed to offend Celestial Ghost Mother. But if he did, then it wouldn't matter if he felt it was safe in Godsifter Prefecture. Ghost Mother could easily slip in without anyone realizing it and just kill him. Bai Xiaochun left the demigods in the hall deeply shaken, including Marquis Zilin. As for Celestial Aged Spirit, he simply narrowed his eyes and allowed Bai Xiaochun to speak. He knew that Bai Xiaochun had been appointed to serve in the second immortal domain by the Saint Emperor himself, and possessed the same official authority as himself. At the moment, he didn't regret demoting the giant Ghost King to provoke Bai Xiaochun. In his opinion, the second immortal domain should only have one voice of authority, and in fact, the Saint Emperor himself had hinted that he also felt the same. Regardless, Celestial Aged Spirit knew that he had to strike a blow to Bai Xiaochun's credibility and reputation. It didn't matter that Bai Xiaochun had been keeping a low profile and spending all his time practicing cultivation. To Celestial Aged Spirit, that wasn't enough. He wanted to actually make a move, and therefore, he stripped the giant Ghost King of his title of Preceptor. When Bai Xiaochun was then powerless to do anything about it, it would ensure that everyone in the second immortal domain knew that Celestial Aged Spirit was the only true authority. However, he had to admit that in some ways, he had underestimated this King Heavenspan. That was something that he had begun to realize as soon as the rumors about Marquis Zilin reached his ears. Don't you see how suspicious this all is? Bai Xiaochun said, forcefully slapping his hand down onto the arm of his throne. The demigods in the hall all struggled to breathe. Although Bai Xiaochun's words weren't particularly incisive, considering his status and the level of his cultivation base, they were still like deadly weapons that pierced all the way to the souls of the demigods. The 10 of you oversee the capital city. Are you telling me you really can't see how odd this all is? Just think for a moment. It's a good thing I'm here. I can only imagine how things would be with only the 10 of you around. Is this really how you usually handle affairs? Fine, let me ask the 10 of you a question. You say that Marquis Zilin hasn't betrayed our country, but would you stake your life on it? He virtually yelled his final sentence, causing something like a tempest to whip through the main hall. The 10 demigods' faces went pale in response, and they shivered and subconsciously stepped back a bit. None of the demigods dared to act as a guarantor for Marquis Zilin. However, Marquis Zilin was under enough pressure as it was, so therefore, he braced himself, clasped hands, and said, Celestial Bai, I'm innocent. Someone is slandering me. Inwardly, though, he was cursing. He might have had his doubts before, but as of this moment, he was convinced that Bai Xiaochun was the one responsible for the slander. He didn't dare to say it, of course. Nor did anyone else in the hall, although they all had come to the same conclusion. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but saying it aloud was a different story. A demigod could not openly criticize a celestial, no matter the circumstances. And therefore, this interchange was doomed to be one-sided. I'm not qualified to pronounce your innocence, Bai Xiaochun continued. We need proof. Perhaps in other situations we could let the matter slide, but this is different. This is a matter of treason. A matter of losing an entire prefecture. Without evidence to rely on to judge the matter, we will have to let His Majesty the Saint Emperor make the final judgment. He didn't even look at Marquis Zilin when he spoke, he stared straight at Celestial Aged Spirit. Marquis Zilin was about ready to explode, but barely managed to keep control. The loss of that prefecture has nothing to do with me, he said. When a mighty celestial like Ghost Mother makes a move, a demigod like me can't do a thing about it. Bai Xiaochun's eyes widened into a glare. Shut up. It would have been better to keep your mouth shut. But now that you mention it, I'm curious why Celestial Ghost Mother didn't actually kill you. And not only did she not kill you, she just let you go. You say you didn't betray our nation. Fine, where's the evidence? Marquis Zilin was truly about to go mad. He was trembling where he stood, blue veins bulging out on his face. He could sense the killing intent in Bai Xiaochun, and also realized that the other demigods seemed to be edging away from him. He opened his mouth to say something, but that was when Celestial Aged Spirit finally intervened. Enough. Frowning, Celestial Aged Spirit looked at Bai Xiaochun with narrowed eyes. I'll be Marquis Zilin's guarantor, he said coldly. Satisfied, King Heavenspan? Marquis Zilin couldn't have been more excited, and immediately decided that he would devote his life to serving Celestial Aged Spirit. No, it's not okay. Bai Xiaochun replied. Although he hadn't anticipated that Celestial Aged Spirit would do this, he was quick to make adjustments to his plan. Thanks to all of his experiences in recent years, he was quickly able to change the speech he had planned earlier. Rising to his feet, he began to speak in a thunderous voice that seemed laced with pain and bitterness. I'm not satisfied with your attitude, Celestial Aged Spirit. I'm not satisfied that the Saint Emperor dynasty has apparently become a place where evidence doesn't count for anything, and a simple guarantee can resolve all issues. I'm not satisfied that your trust is worth more than the safety of the countless citizens of the Saint Emperor dynasty. His words were spoken with courage and conviction. For most of the demigods present, it was as if a completely different Bai Xiaochun had come, and they were visibly shocked. Celestial aged spirit's eyes were as cold as ice as he stared at Bai Xiaochun. He opened his mouth to respond, but there was no way Bai Xiaochun would give him that opportunity. Flicking his sleeve, he continued with his speech. Now that this matter has come to light, it doesn't matter whether or not you guarantee that Marquis Zilin is innocent. The door has been opened for many criticisms to be laid forth. For one thing, isn't it very suspicious that Ghost Mother would say what she did, and that such a commotion would result? You're the guarantor, celestial aged spirit? Very well. In that case, I won't soul search Marquis Zilin. But until all of the investigations have been carried out, we need to prevent anything unexpected from happening. Therefore, to live up to the responsibilities assigned to me by the Saint Emperor, and also to protect the safety of the innumerable citizens of the Saint Emperor dynasty, I hereby order that Marquis Zilin be imprisoned immediately. Only after the investigations are complete and the truth comes to light can he be released. At this point, the gathered demigods realized what was happening. So, it's because Marquis Zilin took Giant Ghost's position as preceptor of Godsifter Prefecture. This is Bai Xiaochun's counter-strike. The 10 demigods all bowed their heads and averted their gazes, hoping to avoid being drawn into a conflict between two celestials. Although they were all loyal to celestial aged spirit, they also needed to avoid offending Bai Xiaochun. Earlier, when Bai Xiaochun was keeping a low profile, they might have had the guts to say something offensive. But now, they realized that he was truly a wolf in sheep's clothing. His methods were a bit crude and cruel, but they were effective. Furthermore, he apparently had the ability to convince Celestial Ghost Mother to help him. His counter-strike was a bit too obvious, and very lacking in finesse. It was almost as if he had just picked up a glob of dog excrement and smeared it across the face of his opponent. A person who would resort to such cruel methods was frightening to even think about, and was the type that no one would intentionally provoke. Marquis Zilin also realized what was happening, and as a result, his eyes were bloodshot with panic. He knew that if he was imprisoned as Bai Xiaochun had ordered, then there was no way he would be able to clear his name easily. In fact, who knew what other things could happen on the outside that would make things worse for him? His intuition was telling him that if he was imprisoned, there was probably an 80% chance he would never again see the light of day. Exalted Celestial, he said shakily, I'm being unjustly accused. Really? Perhaps if Bai Xiaochun had handled things with finesse, he wouldn't be as terrified as he was. But seeing how effective his bald-faced smear tactics were made him fear that Bai Xiaochun would go to any lengths to achieve his goals. As his terror mounted, he looked over at Celestial Aged Spirit. After all, it was Celestial Aged Spirit who had sent him to Godsifter Prefecture to begin with. He had initially been leery of going there, but Celestial Aged Spirit had given the orders, and he had had no choice but to abide by them. Celestial Aged Spirit looked at Bai Xiaochun wordlessly, and Bai Xiaochun said nothing further. Meanwhile, the pressure in the main hall built higher and higher, until it seemed like a windstorm raged therein. The 10 demigods were particularly uncomfortable, and as for Marquis Zilin, he was just about to start crying. The only calm one was the giant ghost king. He almost couldn't believe the show that Bai Xiaochun had put on. Now, the Marquis Zilin who had put him in such a bad position was as weak as a bug. Of course, this was the Saint Emperor dynasty, and Marquis Zilin was backed by a celestial. And yet, everything that Bai Xiaochun had said made sense, making it impossible for Celestial Aged Spirit to offer a retort. Moments ticked by, and the giant ghost king was starting to feel very pleased with how things were going. However, that was when Celestial Aged Spirit's vision shifted from Bai Xiaochun to him. Very well, lock him up. Master Dust City, you shall serve as the preceptor of Godsifter Prefecture. As soon as the words left his mouth, one of the demigods in the hall stepped forward, a fat man who was currently trembling in fear. Inwardly, he was grumbling about being dragged into the affair, and was even considering trying to refuse somehow. But considering how livid Celestial Aged Spirit looked at the moment, he simply clasped hands and offered a thankful affirmation. Despite feeling bad for Master Dust City, the other demigods edged away from him. Marquis Zilin looked like all the energy had drained out of him. His face was pale and his expression listless as he stood there trembling. As for Bai Xiaochun, he frowned slightly. He had to admit that this Celestial Aged Spirit was not an easy opponent to deal with. Not only did he not bicker about locking up Marquis Zilin, but instead focused on the giant ghost king. Clearly, he had no intention of allowing the giant ghost king to have the title of preceptor ever again. Presumably, he would eventually make some other move against him in the future. Wily old fox, Bai Xiaochun thought, snorting inwardly. Locking up Marquis Zilin isn't sufficient, he said loudly. This matter pertains to the loss of a prefecture, to the endangerment of all of the citizens in the nation, as well as the trust of His Majesty the Saint Emperor. Therefore, I'm afraid I must ask some further questions. If Marquis Zilin has indeed been falsely accused, I would be happy to personally clear his name. But if he is truly a traitor, then I refuse to believe that he was acting alone. He would obviously have some accomplices backing him up. His Majesty the Saint Emperor stationed me here in the second immortal domain, and there is no more loyal official here than me. With that, he flicked his sleeve and glared at Celestial Aged Spirit much like a tiger eyeing its prey. When Marquis Zilin heard those words, he was suddenly paralyzed by despair. The other demigods gasped inwardly. Naturally, all of them understood the hidden threat in Bai Xiaochun's words, and knew that they were all suddenly in danger. With Marquis Zilin in his clutches, he could easily drag anyone else into the situation in the name of justice. Trying to prove their innocence later wouldn't do much good, and who knew what sorts of things could happen after they were imprisoned. In the end, Bai Xiaochun might suffer some negative repercussions if the truth came to light, but he was a celestial, and at worst would receive a minor punishment. All he would have to do was claim that he had misunderstood the situation, and the Saint Emperor would likely praise him for his loyalty. Bai Xiaochun had made his threat very clear. If Celestial Aged Spirit dared to do anything to the giant ghost king, then Bai Xiaochun would respond in kind. In fact, he might even make a move against Celestial Aged Spirit himself. Although it wouldn't result in any concrete harm, it would definitely be a big embarrassment. It would also throw the entire second immortal domain into chaos. It was an alarming thought. After all, Bai Xiaochun was a celestial, so there was little they could do to him. And this wasn't his home, so he didn't care much about what happened overall. By this point, Celestial Aged Spirit was quivering in rage, and there was even killing intent in his eyes. This new tactic was as crude and cruel as the way he had slandered Marquis Zilin. And yet, it was explosively effective, and profoundly threatening. Celestial Aged Spirit would never even think of doing something like this. He was calculating and fastidious, and virtually epitomized the sanctimoniousness of the Saint Emperor dynasty. Therefore, Bai Xiaochun's cruel, rude methods had caught him completely unprepared. They were also particularly effective. After a long moment passed, Celestial Aged Spirit reigned in his killing intent. He closed his eyes momentarily, and when he opened them again, he looked completely calm. Preceptor Giant Ghost, you have done excellent work managing Godsifter Prefecture. Master Dust City, are you absolutely set on going there? The demigod Master Dust City was very excited. The truth was that he wasn't set on going to Godsifter Prefecture. In fact, he had no desire whatsoever to do so. Stepping forward, he clasped hands and bowed deeply. Your humble servant can't even compare to fellow Taoist Giant Ghost. Whether in terms of talents, virtues, cultivation base, governing ability, etc., I don't even come close to him. I am more than willing to forego the position of preceptor. In all of the second immortal domain, only fellow Taoist Giant Ghost possibly qualifies to serve in Godsifter Prefecture. The other demigods quickly stepped forward and began to say similar things. Godsifter Prefecture simply cannot function without fellow Taoist Giant Ghost there. I truly hope that the two exalted celestials present will agree that fellow Taoist Giant Ghost is clearly the best option. How wise and brilliant, O exalted celestial. Fellow Taoist Giant Ghost is a rare gem here in the Saint Emperor dynasty, and is obviously the best choice. After everyone spoke, Celestial Aged Spirit nodded his head. Let it be so. Finally, the Giant Ghost King had his position returned to him, although he didn't take much pleasure in it. Having seen this confrontation with his own eyes, he knew that it meant Bai Xiaochun could no longer maintain a low profile in the second immortal domain. Furthermore, there was likely more to come. As for Bai Xiaochun, he was shivering inwardly with apprehension. He would rather Celestial Aged Spirit fly into a rage. That would have been less nerve-wracking. Instead, he got very calm, which seemed far more sinister and foreboding. But now that they had come to an agreement, it did no good to look back with regret. Looking around at the demigods, as well as Marquis Zilin, he smiled. After some thought, I've come to the realization that, considering all of the services Marquis Zilin has performed for the Saint Emperor dynasty, it seems silly to be so hard-hearted over such a small matter. Marquis Zilin, I for one believe that you were slandered. His words caused all of the demigods to breathe sighs of relief. All of a sudden, they realized that this King Heavenspan wasn't impossible to work with after all. And he wasn't the type to push matters to the bitter end. Most excited of all was Marquis Zilin, who had been struck by one wave of misfortune after another this day. As of this point, he was furious with Celestial Aged Spirit, and although he had mixed feelings about Bai Xiaochun, mostly respected him. Rising to his feet, he clasped hands and bowed deeply to Bai Xiaochun several times in a row. Of course, Celestial Aged Spirit noticed all of this, and a grim look once again appeared in his eyes. As of this point, both he and Bai Xiaochun viewed each other as wily foxes. Matters of face had just barely been handled properly in the interchange. However, both of them knew that they were now rivals, and that if the opportunity presented itself, a major conflict would result. Finally, Celestial Aged Spirit turned and left. As for Bai Xiaochun, he wasn't somber like before. He smiled as he said a few words to the demigods, then took the giant Ghost King with him back to his mansion. Once inside, the giant Ghost King let out a long sigh of relief. Bai Xiaochun had originally intended to ask him to stay for a few more days, but he was too anxious to get back to Godsifter Prefecture. After all, if he was gone for too long, who knew what problems might arise there? Before leaving, the giant Ghost King stepped forward and embraced Bai Xiaochun. Xiaochun, you've really grown up. With that he stepped back, threw his head back and laughed heartily. Then he became a beam of light that shot toward the capital city's teleportation portal. Bai Xiaochun watched him leave. For some reason, the giant Ghost King seemed to be getting much older, causing Bai Xiaochun to sigh and think back to everything that had happened in Giant Ghost City. Eventually, he headed back into his mansion, where he sat down cross-legged in his private chamber and pulled out the command medallion from the damaged fan. Even after studying it in much detail, he hadn't found any other function to it than the spiritual energy it emitted. It seems like the spiritual energy is slowly running out. But what exactly does this thing have to do with that fan? After thinking about it for a bit more, he went back to cultivation. With the help of the command medallion, the immortal pills, and the spirit plants, his cultivation base had advanced significantly. He was now getting very close to the peak of the early celestial realm. And much of that speed was because of the energy in the medallion. Days passed. The matter between Marquis Zilin and the giant Ghost King didn't cause a huge controversy in the capital city. In fact, few people had even been aware that the giant Ghost King had been stripped of his title and position. The rumors about Marquis Zilin quickly died down. In accord with the approval of both Celestial Aged Spirit and Bai Xiaochun, all of the power and resources of the second immortal domain were employed to get rid of the rumors and any ill effects they had. To people who weren't in the know, the second immortal domain seemed very peaceful and quiet. However, the preceptors from the various prefectures, as well as the 10 demigods stationed in the capital city, all knew that a storm was brewing. At the center of that storm were Bai Xiaochun and Celestial Aged Spirit. They were like gods to everyone else, so the mere idea of them at odds with each other had people trembling in fear. No one knew when the storm would hit. Perhaps it would be soon, or perhaps it would take some time. But they knew that it would come sooner or later. Pressure mounted, and everyone who was aware of the tension between the two celestials acted with extreme caution in everything, doing everything they could to avoid setting one of the celestials off. As alarm built in the hearts of the people aware of the conflict, an old man in the capital city was paying close attention to everything. He normally wore a nondescript green robe, and would sit at a table on the second floor of one of the taverns in the city. He would arrive in the morning, and would sit there sipping alcohol and staring off into the sky. No one knew his name, but there was something tranquil about him that made it seem obvious his cultivation base was extraordinary. Because of the gleam of intelligence that existed in his eyes, anyone who thought to probe him out and perhaps do him harm would give up on such thoughts immediately. After all, within his calm gaze, there was also something profoundly incisive. There was something about him that surpassed ordinary cultivators. Clearly, he had once held a position of incredible power and authority. That was the only way he could possibly have the extraordinary air to him that he did. He was none other than the Grand Heaven Master. He had originally been looking for the giant Ghost King, but after arriving in Godsifter Prefecture, he found that there was a new preceptor. Thus, he had come to the capital city. Although he had not been there to personally witness Bai Xiaochun's counterattack, he could pick up on the clues and hints. First there were the strange rumors. Then the giant Ghost King's position had been restored, and Marquis Zilin seemed to have fallen out of favor. From that, he could guess much of what had occurred. Although he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at Bai Xiaochun's methods, he had to sigh a bit. After all, Bai Xiaochun was a natural-born trickster and in that regard, was worthy of praise. Although things seemed peaceful and quiet, after everything the Grand Heaven Master had seen in the Arch-Emperor dynasty, how could he not tell that a storm was brewing? Therefore, he changed his plans. Instead of seeking out the giant ghost king, he took up residence in the capital city, both to keep an eye on Bai Xiaochun, and also to size up the city around him, which was the center of power in the second immortal domain. On one particular afternoon as he sat there in the tavern, the Grand Heaven Master put down his cup of alcohol, and his eyes began to glitter brightly. "It's just about time," he murmured. With that, he left the tavern and headed toward Bai Xiaochun's mansion. Bai Xiaochun wasn't paying attention to the outside world. He was completely focused on the damaged fan's command medallion. The energy within the medallion was slowly being emptied out, and as it was, a faint gravitational force was being revealed. It wasn't powerful enough to affect any physical objects around it, but Bai Xiaochun's keen senses detected it. Shocked, he realized that the command medallion likely was an object that could be used to gain access to the fan. It was in the midst of his study of the command medallion that he suddenly sensed a familiar aura outside of his mansion. As soon as he detected it, his eyes snapped open. The Grand Heaven Master? There were a few people from the Heavenspan realm who had left a deep impression on him. One was the aloof gravekeeper, and the other, the cruel, callous Taoist Heavenspan. And then there was the Grand Heaven Master, who came in second only to Taoist Heavenspan when it came to ambition and ruthlessness. He had turned the Arch-Emperor into a mere figurehead, and had even kept the 4 heavenly kings under control, despite the fact that they were so distanced from him physically. In a time when the Wildland's true leader was weak, he managed to keep the place fully united. Of course, that only lasted until Taoist Heavenspan sent all 4 of his main armies against the Wildlands. Even then, they had fought back for years. Some of the Grand Heaven Master's success in all that had to do with the existence of the Gravekeeper, but not much. Any person like him, whether they were from the Heavenspan realm or not, could be considered extraordinary even in the eternal immortal domains. If he had thrown his lot in with the Saint Emperor, he might not have ended up being as important as Bai Xiaochun, but would still have been shockingly valuable. In fact, had he truly been willing to sell out, he could have caused major waves in either of the dynasties. But now, here he was outside of Bai Xiaochun's mansion. He was still in the peak of the demigod realm, but due to some good fortune he had come across in the eternal immortal domains, when he concealed his aura, only a celestial who was actively probing him would be able to tell his level. Shocked, Bai Xiaochun put away the command medallion, vanished, and reappeared outside of his mansion. The first thing he saw was the Grand Heaven Master, standing there tall and straight in his green robe, his eyes glittering with wisdom and insight. He looked like an ordinary old man, albeit somewhat older than before. As soon as Bai Xiaochun appeared in front of him, he smiled. "Greetings, Celestial." This was not at all how he had acted in the Wildlands, but it didn't seem difficult at all for him to offer formal greetings to Bai Xiaochun in this way. The truth was that back in Arch-Emperor City, when Bai Xiaochun had become the Arch-Ancestor, the Grand Heaven Master had immediately understood his own place in the grand scheme of things. Now here they were in the eternal immortal domains, with Bai Xiaochun a celestial. And therefore, the Grand Heaven Master knew exactly how he should treat him. "Grand Heaven Master," Bai Xiaochun said, a smile of joy breaking out on his face. The Grand Heaven Master shook his head and sighed. "Oh, I wouldn't dare go by my old form of address. Just call me C2. Bai Xiaochun laughed heartily. "Oh, that kind of stuff isn't important. Come in, Grand Heaven Master." The truth was that Bai Xiaochun really didn't care much about forms of address. Grabbing the Grand Heaven Master's arm, he led him into the mansion. Along the way, a warm smile covered the Grand Heaven Master's face as he looked around. Eventually, they reached the luxurious and extravagant main hall. At this point, the Grand Heaven Master couldn't help but sigh again. Whether it was in terms of cultivation base or temperament, Bai Xiaochun had clearly changed a lot. The Grand Heaven Master couldn't help but think back to that cautious scoundrel of the past with all of his vicious plans. But now what he saw was a young man deserving of praise. In fact, he was the type of person that the Grand Heaven Master was willing to forego his own personal gain to assist. Looking at Bai Xiaochun with his wise eyes, he slowly said, "Celestial, you currently have 3 major problems that I can help you solve." Moments ago, he had seemed like nothing more than an ordinary old man. But now, he suddenly seemed capable of doing anything. Anyone who saw him now would realize that he was absolutely an extraordinary individual. "Please, tell me everything," Bai Xiaochun said, eyes glittering expectantly. "First, Your relationship with celestial aged spirit is not particularly important, but you definitely need to establish a solid foundation in the second immortal domain. Second, the eternal immortal domains are vast, and there are many obstacles preventing the people of the Heavenspan realm from reuniting. If they aren't gathered soon, they will be assimilated into the other dynasties. Third, although it may seem that you are working toward a goal, the truth is that you don't have any specific direction. With each of these 3 points, his voice grew louder and louder, until it rang back and forth in the hall. Celestial, did I get close to hitting the mark? Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.